Isadora de Ataide Fonseca is a PhD in sociology of culture, and right now she's conducting a research as a postdoctoral researcher at Centro de Estudos Comparatistas, Faculty of Letters, University of Lisbon. Isadora, it's for you 25 minutes, and then for questions afterwards for the debate.
Morning, congratulations for Zaia and our team for this important conference, and also thank you. It's an honor to me to be here and sharing my research. So, journalism and resistance in the press of Portuguese Africa. To discuss and reflect on the press as a privileged field of resistance of the African elites against the colonial project in the territories under Portuguese domination is the main goal of this communication. The African press and the journalism of advocacy, protest, cleanse, and resistance developed in the Portuguese colonies to roll out the monarchy and the republican period. In Angola and Cape Verde, the African press acted mainly between 1870 and the early years of 1920s. In Mozambique and São Tomé and Príncipe, African journalism gained prominence in the Republican period. In Guinea, the African press did not emerge. The demand for equal rights for Africans and Europeans, the claim of improvements in living conditions of the African people, the discussion of the independence of the colonies, the criticism of colonialism and its program were the main issues of the agenda of African journalism. Regarding the role performed by the African press in Portuguese colonies, I would like to point out four main ideas. One, colonial imperialism led to the awakening of national consciousness and the desire for sovereignty, which becomes an obstacle to the construction of empire, as Arndt suggested. Two, the spread of the Western civilization has a dual feature, because in the extent that the colonizer propagates its social forms, behaviors, and institutions, it contributes to the reduction of the difference among the social forces, as Elias noted. Three, as demonstrated by Anderson, the situation of the native elites combined with liberal ideas, the new printing technologies, and the development of capitalism were decisive elements in the emergence of imagined communities, an essential step in the process of modernization. And as a result of the culmination of such factors, African elites used the press as a space of resistance to make claims and to fight. And four, in his study on intelligentsias, Berlin points out as its role the idea of a rational and permanent opposition to a status quo. The philosopher notes that the existence of intelligentsias requires a mix of beliefs in reason and progress, along with a deep moral concern for society, being the feature of the political militance an integral part of its essence. Still, the intelligentsia is engendered by oppressive regimes. In this sense, the colonial oppression led to the emergence of journalists as Eugênio Tavares in Cape Verde, José Fontes Pereira in Angola, João Albazini in Mozambique, and Augustus Gamboa in São Tomé and Príncipe, African intellectuals that made journalism a space of resistance, intervention, and political activism. To illustrate the first main idea, the colonial imperialism leads to awakening of national consciousness and the desire for sovereignty, which becomes an obstacle to the construction of the empire, I present the case of Angola. Over the decades of 1880, 1890, it emerged and strengthened an African press which supported a republican regime, advocated the independence of Angola, fought for the rights of Africans and their equal status in relation to Europeans. The future of Angola, for instance, was a model of resistance journalism. The newspaper promoted the Republican regime, protected the interests of Afro-Portuguese elites, including in trade, denounced racial discrimination, demanded schools for Africans, pointed out the illegitimacy of electoral process, and criticized imperial policies in Angola. The newspaper's critical positions resulted in the persecution of their journalists. Another example of the resistance of the press in this period was newspaper O Farol do Povo in 1873. The paper advocated a republican regime and the independence of Angola. It denounced the corruption of local imperial governments and the wars fought against the African population. The newspaper supported the Afro-Portuguese elites and also natives of Angola, and in the same way bolstered the Republican forces and candidates in the parliamentary elections. The paper's reports, in particular regarding electoral fraud and the slave trade, induced lawsuits against journalists. The case of Cape Verde is illustrative of the second idea, that the spread of Western civilization has a dual feature, because in the extent that the colonizer propagates its social forms, behaviors, and institutions, and so contributes to the reduction of the differences between the social forces. During the monarchic period, native groups used the press, which had been the initiative of European elites, and, for example, Trogue the magazine of Cape Verde of 1899 resisted against the colonial project. Among the many issues presented by the newspaper were, first, the transference of the capital from Praia to São Vicente. Second, the complaint on the proposal of sailing the archipelago by the imperial power. Thirdly, the advocacy of the independence of Cape Verde. Other topics were the complaint of irregularities in colonial administration, the discrimination between European and natives, the claim for the building of technical schools for natives, and finally, the adoption of measures to eliminate hunger, the demand for the development of agriculture, commerce, and industry, and the topic of the local elections. The absence of indigenous policy in Cape Verde did not avoid the practices that discriminate Europeans and Africans. The duality of the colonial project in Cape Verde reinforced Cabo Verdeanidade and nativism, which had used a radical journalism to defend their claims. The nativist intellectuals of Cape Verde were articulated with Pan-African organizations and reproduced their ideals in the local press. The themes and the causes of the newspapers are seen as the proto-nationalism of Cape Verde. The African press in Mozambique can illustrate the third idea that I present, the situation of the native elites combined with liberal ideas, the new printing technologies, and the development of capitalism were decisive elements in the emergence of the imagined communities. The creation of the African Guild of Lourenço Marques in 1908 was a reaction of Africans to colonial duality in Mozambique. The origins of nativism in the territory overlapped and blended with the appearance of an African press. With the African Guild was created the newspaper O Africano. The paper was critical of the Portuguese colonial system and fought for social improvements for Africans. Among the privileged issues of the newspaper were corruption in colonial administration, the bad conditions of African laborers, the alienation of the lands of Africans, Maori schools, the problem of colonial wine, and the living conditions of women and children. And even gave space to international events such as the Russian Revolution. Later, in 1918, the brothers Albazine created the paper O Brado Africano, and until 1926, the paper played a role of resistance against colonial administration and advocated the interests of Africans. It should be noted that the ideas and causes of the African press were taken over by nationalist groups from 1950s. On the issue of intelligentsias, which promoted a rational and permanent opposition to status quo, the case of São Tomé and Prince is paradigmatic. For example, A Liberdade, the Freedom, is an important African paper, and among the main themes of the newspapers were the rights of Africans and cocoa laborers and the political struggle against the local administration. The paper reflected the emergence of Pan-African ideals in São Tomé, for instance, agreeing and publicizing the goals of the Pan-African Congress in 1921 in London. A Liberdade asked for the nationalization of the colonies, a repeal of the laws of exception, claimed for freedom of cocoa laborers and the abolition of forced labor, slavery. It propagates the demand for native education, the need for women assistance, as the critic of, again, local administration, which claimed for elections. Finally, the case of Portuguese Guinea, where the African press did not emerge. The absence of Portuguese authority over native populations, the system of indirect administration, the multiplicity of native political units, and the unenforceability of administrative reforms were the factors that characterized the political status of Portuguese Guinea in 19th century. And these things also help us to understand the absence of an independent press and an African press in Guinea in the monarchic and republican period. The political and economic weakness of the Portuguese presence in Guinea also resulted in its marginal place in the context of the empire and in the low expectations concerning the territory from Lisbon. Thus, in Guinea, the existence of the press was not essential to the Afro-Portuguese and African elites, who were concerned with the occupation of the territory by Europeans. Despite the case of Guinea, we can conclude that the role performed by the African press in Portuguese colonies between the late 19th and early 20th centuries was essential in the resistance and fights of native elites against colonialism and empire. Throughout the press and journalism, African elites gave continuity to the wars promoted by natives against European occupation. Finally, I would like to present an epilogue of the history of the press throughout colonialism, in Portuguese colonies, of course, and also advance my main hypothesis. The inability of the First Republic in developing a coherent colonial policy was a decisive factor for the coup of May 1926, which imposed a military regime in Portugal, followed by an authoritarian period, New State, Estado Novo, which stretched until 1974, as you know. From 1926, increased the control of state and local government on the press in Portuguese Africa. Although until the mid-1930s, journalism had played a moderate monitorial role. From then until the end of the regime, the press was constrained to support the colonial program and its policies, to aid local government and propagate and enhance the authoritarian regime. Although in Mozambique and Angola have maintained a diversity of papers, these expressed a single orientation, pro-government. Although in these colonies promptly there have been attempts for an independent and critical press, these efforts were soon silenced by the authoritarian practices of the Estado Novo. In São Tomé and Príncipe, Cape Verde and Guinea, throughout the last decades of the Portuguese colonialism, circulated a single newspaper in each territory, which had the role of spreading government and regime. However, there have been initiatives of young critics of the regime, namely Africans and descendants of European settlers, who through literary and artistic contents messages expressed criticism towards the authoritarian regime and colonialism. An exemplification of this in the Cape Verde magazine Claridade, Clarity, which was created by an intellectual elite working the state's apparatus. This was a literary magazine of great impact in the Cape Verdean society, and even though it only issued 90 numbers over the course of 24 years, it gave rise to an intellectual movement known as the Claridosos. The articles and poems were written in Creole, and their main themes included drought, hunger, and isolation in the archipelago, with immigration being featured as the only way out to escape economic privation. Claridade's most determinant political contribution consisted in the use of the literature to express a regional consciousness that turned into nationalism from 1950s onward. In Angola, the magazine Message was an initiative of the Cultural Department of the Association of Angola Naturals. In 1951, it published two numbers and had as main goal to spread literary, aesthetic, and ideological messages. Mensagem included among its writers Agostinho Neto, the first president of Angola, Mário Pinto de Andrade, an important intellectual and scholar, and Viriato da Cruz, a writer and political leader of independence, among other critics of the regime and colonialism. In Mozambique, the year of 1947 saw the appearance of Journal of Portuguese Youth in Mozambique, which comprised articles of critics of the regime who became prominent names of literature in the Portuguese language, for instance, Rui Nopfli and Noemi de Souza. Other young activists and future political leaders of Mozambique wrote to Itinerary, a monthly publication of literature and art. For instance, José Craveirinha, writer and journalist, and Marcelino dos Santos, political leader of independence. The magazine stopped being published when their editors was forced into exile in 1955. Finally, in Guinea, as usual, there are no signs of criticism or resistance in the press during the authoritarian period. In short, from the 1940s, critics on colonialism found refuge in literature, poetry, and art to express their opposition to the authoritarian regime and imperialism. Throughout the period study, the 19th and 20th centuries, similarities stand out in the performance of press in the Portuguese colonies, and the press of the colonies was always in interaction and dialogue with the social and political dynamics of the metropolis, as well as among each other. With this view, I present my main working hypothesis. Journalism and press were privileged tools in resistance to colonialism. Critics, claims, and ideas disseminated by the press came out together in different colonies. So we should rethink the press in the Portuguese Empire's colonial space in terms of a single public sphere. Thank you.
Thank you, Isadora. I'll start with I have lots of questions, mainly on this long duration of the Mongolian press or Mozambique press and engaged press. My first question would be to go back a little bit to the formation, education of this African intelligentsia under Portuguese colonial empire? Where are they formed, and how do they manage to emancipate from this education? Because they have a very colonial education, most of them. This is my first question. My second question is related to their circulation, because starting with the Peace Conference in Paris in 1919, all these Pan-African networks start connecting themselves and interfere, join, disapprove. I was wondering if you have found cases in this situation in the examples you studied.
I can pick more
and
questions.
More questions and then answer.
Yes, I have just one question. Could you explain more about the revue Claridad? It's the same magazine like Claridad in Argentina and Claridad, that is the Latin American anti-imperialist magazine. This magazine has the same name like Clarté, Henri Barbus magazine in France. Could you explain more about that? Because Claridad, Argentina Claridad was the main anti-imperialistic face in South America, especially. Thank you.
D'autres questions?
Okay, thank you for your questions. Concerning the education of intellectuals and journalists in Portuguese Africa, generalizing, I can say that the majority of these intellectuals are Afro-Portuguese orange, a native orange. And some of them has education in Portugal or in South Africa, for instance, and of course this gave them a different feedback and the possibility to use the press as a platform to political claims. But it's very interesting, especially in the case of Mozambique, Albazini brothers, they traveled in Europe and has a direct connection with Pan-African movement. And of course, this made the difference in their intervention in the case of Mozambique. Concerning the circulation, this is very important to me because it's interesting when I read the newspapers of São Tomé, for instance, in 19th century, and I can find the journalism had news concerning France or British Empire. And in the same way, you can find notices about Portuguese colonies in British or French newspaper. So I think this is per se a team to investigation, the relation among European newspapers and African newspapers, how these work in the course of 19th and 20th century. Concerning Claridade, I'm sorry, I don't know the Argentina clarity or Claridade, but concerning this Cape Verdean magazine, Claridade, this is a very regional magazine and points out very specific questions and problems and issues concerning Portuguese colonialism in Cape Verde, and local problems is the main issues as hunger, drug, the problems in agriculture, And but I can point after for you some reference that could interest you. Okay, thank you.
On prend une autre question. Une autre question, Devika.
I just had a quick question. I wanted to ask you about the reach of these newspapers in the hinterland, because that's one thing, of course, that distinguishes Portuguese colonialism, is how much it is concentrated for historical reasons on the coastal shores. How much, and also when you speak about a single public sphere at the end, which is what you ended, are we talking mainly about quote-unquote coastal enclaves like Luanda or São Lourenço, or is there at least an effort to try to reach other forms of elites, African elites who don't belong to that history?
Thank you. My work is a synthesis work, of course, but I'm not only studying the African press, I also studied the press, the press during colonial time in Portuguese Africa. But I'm not only referred to Africa. I could say the same concerning the Portuguese press in Macau, for instance, or the Portuguese press in Goa. Yes, of course. In Angola and Mozambique, the newspaper edition was especially in Lourenço Marques and Luanda. But you can find different titles in 19th and 20th century in the interior of the provinces, of the colonies. It's different in Cape Verde and São Tomé and Guinea because it's a very small archipelagos. But including Cape Verde, in different islands, you can see different newspapers. So this is my working hypothesis, but I believe in the Portuguese empire, the press of the different spaces is always in dialogue with metropolis and with other colonies. Yes, thank you.
Merci à tous. Zaya, on laisse ça.